welcome you and thank you for joining the ACEs Connection sponsored webinar, Integrating Climate Trauma into ACEs Prevention, with our guest, Bob Doppelt from the International Transformational Resilience Coalition. This is our second in a series of 3 webinars on climate and ACEs. Next slide, please. So I'm Gail Kennedy. I'm a community facilitator at ACEs Connection. And we have on the back end our technical team of Allison Saruba and Rafael Maravilla, who are behind the scenes part of our webinar production team here at ACEs Connection. So we'll get started in a minute, but I just want to give you a couple of housekeeping things first. So the webinar will run for 90 minutes. We'll be recording it and we'll make it available. We'll make both the recording and the slides available on ACEs Connection and to everyone who's signed up for the webinar. We have time scheduled at the end of the presentation for questions. But in the meantime, you can write your questions. You should see a Q&A function or button down on the bottom of your screen. You can write those questions and we'll be collecting the questions throughout the presentation, and we'll save plenty of time to get those questions answered. Now, if you have any technical issues, there's a chat button there, and we will deal with any technical issues that you're having. Just write those into the chat. So first of all, I just want to say a couple words about ACEs Connection. ACEs Connection, first, ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So ACEs Connection, we're the human and the digital catalyst supporting the worldwide ACEs and resilience movement and telling its authentic stories. We have an active social network, acesconnection.com. We have more than 37,000 members nationally and internationally, and that support communities to heal trauma and develop resilience. If you aren't yet a member of ACEs Connection, please consider joining, and you can see how to do that here. Next slide. We have, I mentioned that we are doing a series of webinars on climate and ACEs, and our next webinar in this series is upcoming on November 13th, the human impact of climate change. And you'll get a link to register for this upcoming webinar, so please consider trying to join us for that one. Next slide. I want to point out a couple of things on ACEs Connection, that these are a couple of resources that may be useful for folks here on this webinar. You'll find here highlighted 2 boxes there on the navigation bar of the home page of ACEs Connection, Communities and Map the Movement. Next slide. So when you go to communities, you can look for the International Transformation Resilience Coalition community on ACEs Connection. So this is a community site that is free and available for you all to join. And you'll find articles, resources that Bob will be going over today. And you can connect with folks from across the country and across the globe that are addressing issues that we'll be talking about today. Next slide. On the Map the Movement tab, what you'll see is you'll find ACEs initiatives. These are community ACEs initiatives in your state. So you can click on the button and you can find those blue or yellow buttons. The blue ones are the community and the yellow ones are statewide initiatives. And I encourage you to get involved in your local ACEs initiative if there is one. And if you don't find one in your area, please contact us at ACEs Connection. Be in touch with us and we can help you get one started. Next slide, please. So I'm honored to introduce this webinar, which could not be more timely. I'm here in California, and our governor this weekend has issued a state of emergency. We have fires raging across the state. I live in Northern California, where we had hurricane strength winds yesterday, and more winds are predicted for tomorrow. We have over 200,000, at least the last I checked, 200,000 people that are in mandatory evacuation because of a fire here in Northern California. And a new fire has just started last night and is raging near Los Angeles. So we're recognizing that unfortunately this is our new abnormal. So I'm so grateful that Bob Doppelt could take time out of his busy world and offer this webinar for us today. So today Bob will give an introduction to the need, methods, and benefits of preparing people for the traumas and toxic stresses of climate disruption. He'll talk about the need for building a culture of transformational resilience and explain some of what he means by that, and then introduce some skills in presencing and purposing that we can all use. Next slide. So first, a little about Bob. So Bob Doppelt founded and coordinates the International Transformational Resilience Coalition, or ITRC, and is the director of the Resource Innovation Group that is affiliated with Willamette University. For almost a decade, he directed the Climate Leadership Initiative and taught systems thinking at the University of Oregon. Prior to that, he ran a research institute and taught at Portland State University. His academic training is in both counseling, psychology, and environmental science. And this unique combination of disciplines really comes through the work that he'll be talking about today and with ITRC. Next slide. Bob has authored several books related to the things he'll be talking about today. You can see them here. And again, you'll get these slides, so if you want to, you don't have to scramble to write down the titles, but you'll be able to go back and find these titles, find these books if you're interested. So I'm honored to welcome Bob.
Great. Well, thank you, Gail, for that introduction, and I just want to thank the ACES Connection Network for the wonderful partnership we've had for a number of years here, and the ITRC has had for a couple of years, and the work we do together. It's been a wonderful partnership and connection. Again, as Gail said, my name is Bob Doppelt, and I coordinate the ITRC, International Transformational Resilience Coalition. Let me just tell you a little bit of background about how I got into this work. My organization, when I ran the Climate Leadership Initiative at the University of Oregon, here in Eugene, Oregon, where I live, as Gail said, and we had a nonprofit that I run that was affiliated with the university, so we were able to go around the country and help many local and state and county governments develop climate action plans. We were one of the first organizations, this is going back 10, 15 years ago, doing this work, and we were funded by the Rockefeller and the Kresge and the Ford Foundations and others. And so, for example, one of my staff organized the Southeast Florida Climate Resiliency Compact, and we organized the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, and we spun all of those off and over time, as we do as a university program. But even though I was trained in counseling psychology, our organization, as with most of the climate field, was focused on the external physical dimensions of responding to the climate crisis. So in Southeast Florida, we were helping folks think about and talk through and plan for sea level rise and storm surges, et cetera. And then Superstorm Sandy occurred, which not only hit northeast part of the U.S., but Southeast Florida. And that made it very clear that those kind of disasters do cause mental health problems, such as severe anxiety, depression, PTSD, as well as psychosocial problems, where people begin to take out their distress on others, including more child abuse or child neglect, because the adults were traumatized and dealing with other issues, more alcohol and drug abuse, et cetera. And that's what led me to realize my organization, and the climate field in general, were missing a critical missing element. And that is, how do we prepare people for the disasters and the related toxic stresses that are associated with climate change? So that's how we got into this, and we organized the ITRC now 7 years ago. And we've been trying to first promote sort of raise awareness of the need to get out front of these issues, the mental health and psychosocial, what I call psychosocial spiritual impacts of climate change, because it's insufficient to try to respond after a disaster, and I'll talk about that as I dive into this. But also then to teach skills to do that. And we have members mostly in North America, but we have some in Europe, we have some in New Zealand and Australia and other parts of the world that are beginning to try to dive in and teach these kinds of skills to others. So we're going to talk about that. Next slide, please. So what most people have failed to realize or don't want to acknowledge, and certainly most governments don't want to acknowledge, is that we are in the midst of a civilization-changing event that is climate disruption. You can move on there. The disasters and toxic stresses are already affecting people across the U.S., across North America, and across the world, and it's going to get increasingly impactful and eventually impact every aspect of society, and the cumulative and direct impacts will harm the psychological and psychosocial spiritual health of everyone as time plays out. Next slide. I keep going there and finish that one and go to the next slide. And what we need to get our heads around is that the climate crisis is unlike anything modern society has ever faced. Even if we're wildly successful in significantly cutting emissions at a global scale, which we haven't been successful at all yet, it's going to worsen for decades. Even if we drop emissions, cut emissions, the emissions already in the atmosphere and the emissions are already in the pipeline will mean that the climate crisis is going to get worse for decades, many scientists say for hundreds of years, and it's going to increasingly intermix fast-growing disasters with chronic and intense, or you know the term, toxic stresses that offer less and less time for recovery. Normally we think of a disaster, then there's followed by a number of years where people can recover. We're seeing across the world already that people have less and less time because there's one disaster, then it's followed by these toxic stresses, and then another disaster. Keep going now, please. I guess advance, I'll use that term. And consequently, what we're seeing already in many parts of the world and here in the U.S., in North America, is that it's severely traumatizing and stressing adults. These impacts are disrupting the social support networks that are very critical and other very important protective systems. It's aggravating racism and other forms of systemic oppressions as people withdraw into a self-protective survival mode and say, oh, you're the reason for my problems, or stay away, I don't want to deal with you. And it undermines the social determinant of health. All of those factors, as you all know who are sitting in on participants, they all can increase ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Advance, please. So if we leave these issues unaddressed, the psychological and psychosocial spiritual issues, the resulting maladies will be as bad as the physical impacts. We will be running around, humans will be harming themselves, harming others, and harming the environment, natural environment, at a scale that is as bad as the actual impacts themselves. And because people get traumatized, who are traumatized, have a hard time focusing on external issues or just move into a survival mode, it's also going to be very difficult to promote further emission reduction efforts because people aren't going to care about that. They're just going to care about survival. So this will threaten the health and well-being of people and reduce our ability to reduce the climate crisis to manageable levels. But we, at the same time, despite all these threats, we have placed little focus on preparing people for these kinds of traumatic stresses to come. To the extent that it really has been recognized, except for a program that you'll hear from a few programs, including one that Gail will talk about at the end of the session, the primary response has been a disaster mental health or mental health first aid, trying to help stabilize people during and immediately after a disaster. Health has recently become a focus with a lot of organizations focused on climate change and health issues, but the focus predominantly still is on physical health physical illnesses, physical diseases. There's been very little focus yet on the disaster, on the psychological and psychosocial spiritual impacts, and working on that. And so while both of those focuses are important, we need strong disaster mental health programs. We need to work on the physical health side of climate change. Neither of those is going to go very far without an equal emphasis on proactively, and what I mean by that is focusing on prevention to prepare people for these psychological and psychosocial spiritual impacts that are already happening and that are speeding our way as climate change worsens. So we really have to place an equal emphasis on the human dimensions of the crisis if we want to have success with these other critical elements. Next slide, please. But at the same time, we have to realize that the climate crisis also offers a profound, a really unbelievable opportunity for transformation. We all know, think of your own life, think of people you work with, that as painful as it can be, adversity is often what we need. It's our greatest impetus for learning, growth, and transformation. Can we think about a way to use this crisis to transform the mental models we hold, the way we take care of ourselves, the way we take care of our children, the way we take care of others, the way we operate our economies and societies? This is what the climate crisis offers us, this opportunity to say, whoa, wait, we should learn something from this, a lot from this, and we can actually take a much more healthy path down the road. Next slide, please. So imagine the benefits of a global preventative transformational resilience movement, and that's what the ITRC is trying to promote, that helps all adults and youth, not just social service providers or mental health leaders, but everyone, learn how trauma and toxic stress affect their mind and body and behavior. So everyone becomes trauma informed. Everyone is able to identify and build on their strengths. Everyone is able to enhance personal and collective protective factors so people can begin to think and act in healthy ways, even in unhealthy conditions, as climate disasters and toxic stresses accelerate. And imagine a global movement that helps all nonprofit, private, and public organizational leaders learn how to promote social narratives that help shift cultural norms and practices and make their groups, their organizations, their communities safe, healthy, just, and equitable, resilience-enhancing entities. And imagine a global movement, or a movement here in the U.S., or a movement in your community that helps everyone learn how to use adversities as transformational catalysts to find new meaning, purpose, and hope in life in ways that also motivates them to increase the well-being of others and to begin to restore the natural environment as a way to increase their own sense of well-being. That's a form of post-traumatic growth, and we'll talk about that in a second. So trauma and toxic stress is really epidemic today. You can see it all around you. Many of you on the phone might be feeling the stressors. You know, there's high level of ACEs, there's income inequality, there's fear of violence, poverty. The speed of life is just ramping up for a reason I'm not exactly sure why, except that that's how our economy is operating. There's racism and sexism, political polarization, lack of jobs, and these are just some of the stresses that people experience. And I don't know of a time that, at least in my lifetime, that I've ever seen this level of trauma and toxic stress. And advance, please. And to these now, we need to add the acute disasters and those toxic stresses generated by rising global temperatures. They aggravate all of those stresses that people already experience, and they're adding a whole number of new types. So this is not going to be a webinar on climate science, but I just want to make sure everybody's grounded in what we're talking about or why this is important. Average global temperatures have already risen by about 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels, most of it since 1975, and it really took off after World War II. And just last year, I'm sure most of you know that the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, said that we must globally cut emissions by 45%, almost by half, by 10 years, now, 10 and a half years, and essentially to zero within 30 years or so, to keep temperatures from rising more than 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, because it's that 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold that most scientists believe we will, if we pass that, we will trigger irreversible and catastrophic effects. We simply can't stop it. We work very closely with the physical scientists because of our role, half in and half out of academia, and I can tell you that on a technical basis, we can keep emissions low enough, we can reduce the emissions low enough to prevent this kind of catastrophe. But from a practical perspective, very few scientists think there's a chance we'll be able to prevent temperatures from rising above that 1.5 degrees Celsius. We need some profound political, social, economic, energy use changes. So no matter what, I hope we're successful, but we're going to come close. But even if we can constrain temperatures because of the emissions already in the atmosphere, we can expect more frequent extreme disasters and toxic stresses to accelerate, become more surprising for a century or more. So we have to get prepared for this. We have to get our heads around this. If we're just working on the specific issue our organization is funded to work on or committed to work on, including ACEs, and don't account for what's coming our way that will aggravate and make it so much more difficult to address the issues we're trying to address, we're really going to run into some very serious problems. Next slide, please. So what are some of the consequences? We'll just quickly go through these. We've all seen these more frequent and extreme, the storms of all kinds, wind, rain, snow, and it's not global warming. It's always been hard to find the right term to call what's happening. It's the disruption of the climate system. Actually, what it is that the interrelated disruption of the climate, ecological, and biodiversity systems on Earth that's happening. The short form is climate change, climate disruption, global warming, but it's really disrupting the interrelated climate, ecological, biological systems on Earth. And the result is, more extremes of all kinds. So sometimes it'll be way hotter, heat waves and other sort of temperature extremes, as you can see on the right. And other times it might be colder and more snow. And that's because as more heat evaporates moisture from the face of the Earth, it goes up into the atmosphere. It comes down as precipitation. When it's colder out, that precipitation is heavier, but couldn't turn into snow. So you get bigger snowstorms as well as bigger rainstorms. But wildfires and smoke emergencies, as Gail just said, where they're experiencing right now in California, droughts and food shortages, rising sea levels, river flooding, and we can't see that on the bottom. But these are the things we know are happening and will increasingly become more extreme and frequent, but there are going to be many, many surprise disasters that we cannot predict with our global climate models. So we just have to be prepared for all types of changes happening because we've disrupted the climate ecosystem, biological systems that keep the nature, so to speak, at a relatively livable level. Next slide, please. So equally important to the disasters are ongoing and toxic stresses, and they come from experiencing directly or seeing or worrying about our future and the future of our children, the loss of place, the loss of our community, the loss of our culture, and the breakdown of the natural environment, the disruption of our social support networks, or forced migration. We have to leave. We have to become climate refugees. We can't live here anymore. Food and water and other resource shortages that our group, members of our organization, are seeing around the world, economic disruptions, job losses, new illnesses and diseases, disaster-related crime and violence. These are all, and many other surprising toxic stresses. So It's not just the disasters, it's these stresses that are rising everywhere where our members work that we really need to prepare people for. Next slide, please. That's a Chicago Cubs logo, and it's my favorite team, and so I'm going to turn to Gail for a second.
Go Cubs. So Bob, can you talk some about those psychological and the psychosocial spiritual consequences of climate disasters and toxic stress? Talk some more about that, and then how they can increase ACEs. I want to be sure that our audience that I think we have some that are in the climate world and some that are in the human resilience ACEs world. So can you talk to me about that?
You bet. Yeah, thank you. Good question. Wonderful symbol there. Next slide, please. So scroll down a little bit. There we go. So there are many, many studies that have come out that describe the mental health and psychosocial or psychosocial spiritual impacts. I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. The American Psychological Association 2 years ago came out with a study on it, and the mental health and our changing climate. And their quote, highlight quote was, direct acute experience with climate change can produce sudden and severe mental health consequences, and they have a decent study on that. But since then, there's even been more studies come out. You can look at the library on our website, the ITRC website, that has a whole list of the studies of the impacts. Our grad students do the study. It hasn't been updated in a year and a half, so there's some that have even come out since then. But really, all you have to do is start Googling the mental health or psychosocial impacts of climate change, and you'll see a raft of research that's emerging. Next slide, please. Here's a summary of what is really happening. So let's just stop there for a second. And most of you know this, I think, because you're in the resilience world, although some of you might not if you're in another field. What happens when people experience a significant trauma or a toxic stress, a severe unrelating stress, is that the fear and alarm center in our brain, and this is the neuropsychology of climate of trauma and stress 101, or it's not even 101, it's 1. It's more complicated than this. We have the amygdala in our brain is the fear and alarm center, as you could call it. It always sort of searches the environment for us, scans the environment for any kind of potential threat, and when it sees one or senses one, it releases neurochemicals into our bloodstream, mostly cortisol and adrenaline, that prepares us, get our body hyper-aroused, that prepares us to fight back, to flee the scene, or if it's overwhelming, to freeze, and either we freeze and get ourselves into trouble, or sometimes we freeze and hope that the threat passes by us. And so this is this is a good thing, this fear-based reaction. It's an adaptation that has helped humans survive for millions of years, thousands of years. But what it does is we have a physical reaction. Our blood pressure goes up, our pulse rate. Sometimes that leads to difficult breathing and cold sweats, muscle tension, et cetera. But it's all to get us ready to go. And it's connected to, because the mind and body reactions are very connected together, to, we often end up worrying a lot. We have excessive fear or guilt, et cetera. And if it's overwhelming, it can shatter the assumptions and beliefs we hold about the world. That's the definition of trauma in many ways, that our core assumptions, beliefs about the world and our role in it become shattered. It's like, it's not what I thought. It's no longer a safe place, et cetera. But those reactions help us deal with an immediate threat. Just go down a little bit, one more. And they're a good adaptive reaction unless those cortisol and adrenaline, that hyperarousal, is not discharged. And if it's not let go when the threat is gone, or when the threat continues and you continue in that hyperaroused state, what began as a helpful adaptation can often become harmful. So next, advance, please. And often what happens is it leads to maladaptive coping behaviors. We try to numb ourselves. People try the self-numbing by legal or illegal substance or food or tobacco use. Some people try to seek relief by diverting themselves into hypervigilance, or they get so totally involved with social media, electronic video games. Others turn their distress on others and try to seek relief on that way, including their children, or on others via abuse or aggression or violence. And still others dissociate, they disconnect with what's happening, or they deny, or they neglect people around them as they try to do that. And that often leads to reenactment, meaning because they're disconnected from what's happening, they repeat the same behaviors that they used before that got them into the same kind of situation, all of which leads us to less ability to cope and problem solve and to enhance our well-being. Advance, please. If that kind of behavior continues, and most of us experience kind of maladaptive coping at some point in our lives. We've had a really bad week at work and we go home and we drink too much alcohol. Or we've had problems with a relationship, and we get angry and we lash out at our kids or our spouse or whatever it might be. This is not unnatural. It happens to all of us. But most of the time we're able to discharge that. We say, oh, no, I'm not going to drink much more. I'm done. I'll get myself into a good situation. But if it continues, we often see people break down in many, many different ways. Breakdown becomes all-encompassing. You see physical health problems, many cancers, heart diseases, and other sorts of health problems are either directly caused by or aggravated by ongoing stress and maladaptive coping behaviors. You see psycho-emotional problems, anxiety, depression, PTSD, and spiritual problems. And that's what I mean by psychosocial spiritual. What we're seeing in many places in the U.S. and around the globe is growing hopelessness and a sense of helplessness, loss of spirit that causes people to say, well, what the heck, I'll do whatever I want, or to take their anxiety and depression out on others. Cognitive behaviors, memory loss, behavioral problems, as we talked about, aggression and or withdrawal, all of which again leads to less ability to cope and problem solve and to enhance well-being. Please advance. And if many people experience that kind of maladaptive coping and the personal breakdown, many people are in this continual state, this continual hyperarousal, or the flip side, the sort of depression caused by these kinds of ongoing traumas and toxic stresses, you get social breakdown, what we call trauma-organized groups, trauma-organized communities, and I think we're starting to see trauma-organized entire societies in different parts of the world, where there's just high levels of distrust and despair. Everything seems meaningless, low empathy and compassion for others. Authoritarianism and extremism grows. We versus they polarization grows. Interpersonal aggression and violence grows. There's no concern for the natural environment, which in fact is triggering many of these issues. And so that makes those problems worse. And again, we have less ability to cope and problem solve and enhance our well-being. So this is a vicious cycle. You can advance two little lines there. This becomes a vicious cycle that we're seeing in many communities, many regions, and many nations around the world. It's sometimes indirectly related to climate disasters and toxic stress, and more increasingly directly related to a disaster or water shortage and food shortages or heat waves, et cetera. So, and this is what the research that you can find on the web and on our website is beginning to document in different ways. Next slide, please. So ACEs also is affected. I'm going to let Gail explain this slide.
So this slide actually came about, this is an infographic because we at ACEs Connection had first been focusing on family or household, the tree of ACEs. When we first started ACEs Connection, we really tended to focus on the original ACE study and the kind of the consequences of family or household ACEs adversity in childhood. But then we very soon learned that and started working with others. We're looking at the underlying or the roots part of that tree. So community adversity and exposure to community adversity. And Bob talked about some of those things that you'll see here listed. And then after that, we got involved with, actually, I was honored to be able to go to a workshop with Bob and some others. And Jane Stevens, our founder and CEO of ACES Connection, met with Bob and understood what he was talking about with the environmental or the climate-related exposures that cause adversity. And we realized, like, all of these kinds of exposures or realms are going to affect toxic stress the same way. So if it's a household family situation, if it's a community situation, or if it's an environmental situation. So after that workshop with Bob, we decided that we needed an infographic that captured all of these types of ACEs, ACEs exposure, so that we really could see the many types and complexity of it. So that's what this infographic is, and later we'll show you where you can download it and have it yourself. Is that good enough, Bob?
Yeah, thank you, Gail. It's a great graphic, I think, and it shows that basically how it looks like it's a tornado, but it really it is a tornado that's coming our way, but it's a massive storm coming our way too that will aggravate both the personal and family causes of ACEs, but also the social determinants or pressures that lead to ACEs. It's going to really impact and increase ACEs in many ways unless we get out front of this, and we'll talk about that in 1 second here. But I think one thing I want to just help people get their heads around is that the environment, the natural environment, has always and continues to shape the way people think and behave just as much as other people shape our thinking and behavior, including our parents, the communities we live in, etc. Just think about the way people think and behave that live in a desert area versus a mountainous area or an area that's extremely wet. People learn how to adapt over time to different environments. It causes them to make different kinds of technologies, to think, to plan different ways. They live their lives differently. So the environment has always had a very significant impact on the way people think and behave, but we don't really realize that. We think I'm just going to respond to what my parents want or what my community wants or what my professional society wants, but the natural environment has always played a major role, and now it's going to play an even bigger role because we've disrupted the natural climate, ecological, biodiversity systems that have together interacted together for thousands of years and kept the Earth's climate at relatively stable levels. And that stability is what has allowed civilization to develop. And that is now breaking down. It's been disrupted. We can use our climate models to sort of predict what might happen, but I think there's a lot of unknowns, many unknowns. All we can really say with certainty is there's going to be a whole lot more impacts on every aspect of society, and we got to get prepared for that. So this is a really big hurricane coming our way. It's already hitting many people, but we have to get our heads around that. Next slide, please. And so what we're seeing worldwide, ITRC members that work around the world in different areas, mostly working in communities that have been hard hit by a disaster, with increasingly more and more working on the prevention side, is a growing level of individual and family traumas, therefore ACEs, but also social and cultural and intergenerational traumas. People are passing their traumas and the reaction to the traumas and their thinking and behaviors on to the next generation. And all of these types of traumas can cause people to harm themselves with this maladaptive coping behaviors that we talked about and you all know very well, or they harm their children, or they harm other people, and or they harm the natural environment even more. as a way, they think they're going to protect themselves by doing things to the natural environment, but actually what it does, it makes things worse because it aggravates this climate, ecological, biological crisis that we're in. Next slide, please. So Gail's going to hit a home run for us now.
Yeah, my turn. Okay, so Bob, this is very distressing. And I know there are things we can do to constructively respond to these risks and what we know is coming, that hurricane, as you said, that's coming. So can you talk about what we can do to respond?
Yes, thank you. Again, that's the key. So the bad news is over, okay? And it's always distressing to start off with that kind of information, but we have to get our heads around it. Next slide, please. First, I think it's really important to realize we have to think about these issues, about our response, way differently than what we've already been thinking about it. We need a whole new way of thinking and responding to a temperature rise of 3 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit or more, 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius or more. Next slide, please. So one of the things we've seen around the world, you just think about anything you've just recently seen, that the disaster mental health programs, helping people immediately during and right after disaster to stabilize them, they're very important, but they're going to be increasingly overwhelmed. Most are already pretty fragile because they're run by volunteers, and the people who are supposed to go in and help others with their psychological distress are often impacted themselves or have family members who are impacted, and so they're trying to do both. Or they simply can't get to the area that's distressed. Think of Puerto Rico. There was very little disaster mental health programs going on there after they got hit, and it took a long time to get disaster mental health programs up into Paradise, California, when that community burned down, et cetera. There are also stopgaps because they only help people try to stabilize people during and immediately after disaster. So they're short term. They don't really help people with the ongoing stress, and many of the mental health problems, often and psychosocial problems, show up 6 months to a year or more after the disaster, and these programs are long gone by then. And just as importantly, they're really inadequate because it's not just people directly impacted by a disaster that really need assistance or need skills and tools to deal with these the changes that are happening in society. There's millions of people that are experiencing toxic stresses of any kind already, and will increasingly deal with that. So they're really going to be inadequate. They don't help the larger population address what's happening. Next slide, please. And many social service programs, mental health programs, social service treatment programs are, while also very, very important, they're also going to be increasingly inadequate because most are siloed into child and family work or mental health or physical health or low-income programs. They're not designed to address 2 to 5 co-occurring psychological and psychosocial spiritual maladies that are happening at the same time. And they're not able to assist all the people that will be impacted by climate changes and this crisis we're in. So they're very important. All the work you all are doing with ACEs is extremely important. But unless we think about this differently, the pressures coming your way for services and service treatments is just really going to be increasingly overwhelming. Next slide, please. And even the traditional concepts of resilience is going to be inadequate. We mostly think about resilience as helping people bounce back to pre-crisis conditions. Slide down a little bit more, please. But it's going to be impossible to bounce back. Again, thinking about Puerto Rico or Paradise, California, or other places that are the most extreme impacts that are aggravated by rising temperatures, people there aren't bouncing back to pre-crisis conditions. Their lives are fundamentally different now. And even with that, many people don't want to bounce back to where they were before. If you have been traumatized or severely stressed in your life, through racism or sexism or a disaster, you don't want to be able to bounce back to how you felt during that or right after that experience. Most traumatized people want to increase their sense of well-being significantly above what they felt before the latest disaster. Next slide, please. And also the preparedness, the disaster preparedness programs, again, while very important, have not really worked well. Rand Corporation assessed them a couple of years back, and for this kind of work, they're not really very sufficient. So here's the graph they put up. On the right side is preparedness. They're usually a plan-based program run by government agencies. They're disaster center. They focus on risks. They're narrowly defined, and they try to, again, build back to the same. And many climate programs are very much that way. We want to keep business as usual going. That's what it means to adapt to climate change. But resilience, in the way we're using it and the way Rand used it, is really fundamentally different. It's relationship-based. It's based on the whole community. It's long-term. It's ongoing. It's based on building on strength. It's broadly defined. And it also includes a focus on the natural environment, making sure we are protecting and restoring the climate, ecological, biological systems that we have impacted so that we, over time, reduce the risk to manageable levels. Next slide, please. So the only real solution that we need to focus on is prevention. And this means giving people information, skills, and tools before the impacts occur. And we know prevention works. ACEs prevention, your work works. Smoking prevention, minimum age laws, all sorts of things that are preventative, we know work well, but they take time to get going, to implement, etc. So we need to start now in your communities, at the state level, the national level, and globally. We really need to begin to launch prevention programs now to get our act organized and grow them and expand them so that every adult and child learns resilience skills, just like everyone, at least in this country, learns how to read and write. They should all be learning resilience skills at the same time. Next slide, please. And our focus, and we hope to convince you to think about this also, is we really want to launch a major national and global movement, prevention movement, to build a culture of transformational resilience. Let's talk about what I mean by that. Next slide. So this is the common phases normally seen in a disaster. On the far left side, you see that often, but not always, there's a warning. We get some warning of pre-disaster. With climate change, this has been warned about for 30, 40 years, actually. Some would say back into the late 1800s, when scientists first discovered that more carbon dioxide traps more heat in the atmosphere. But often then, you don't get much warning for the fire, the wildfire that occurs, or other kinds of impacts. It can be hours or even minutes. So when the impact occurs, moving to the right on the slide, usually groups go through a heroic phase, as it's called. And it occurs right during and maybe right after the impact, where people will put their life on the line, some people, to help others, to save others, to jump in the river and pull somebody out, etc. We usually see some of that, and it's often thought of, well, those are really resilient people. And it's really a wonderful thing to see. And then the impact is over, and we often see a community cohesion phase occur that can last just a few days or a few months, where people in the community who might never have talked to each other, don't even like each other, or certainly don't know each other, they come together to help each other out. They cook food together. They share water. They give people places to sleep and stay warm and dry. And this is often thought as resilience also. We see this often, and a couple of books have been written about disasters, and that's what they talk about, and they stop there. That this community cohesion phase, that's what people do in disasters. Actually, what normally happens in any significant disaster is then people go through a long period of disillusionment. Once they have to go back to their own lives and try to put it back together, deal with the loss of property or their own injury or the loss of family or friends, and the whole disruption to their life, they become what we call disillusion, and this can last for months to years, and also take a month or years to really start showing up. And out of it comes severe mental health, social, and spiritual distresses. This is when the resilience skills are actually the most important. People can really, and you might have gone through this in your own life, really hit bottom, so to speak. And then after, some people remain at that level, they really remain distressed for a long time, but most of the time people begin to recover. They come to terms with that happening, they work through the grief and the anger, etc. And the resilience skills are also extremely vital there. The disillusionment and recovery phase are really critical. But that can be set back by another disaster. You start to recover, and then boom, you hit another wildfire or whatever it might be, or then it's a drought, or an anniversary reaction of some kind can cause a regression. You know, this is the day 2 years ago when I lost my loved one, or the storm hit and I lost my house, or whatever. And go one more slide, there we go. So many people eventually, if there's not too many disasters or anniversary reactions, they eventually bounce back, so to speak, that's what we call it, if they have sufficient time to recover, which can be often months to years, and eventually return to some semblance of pre-crisis levels. That's resilience, it's normally thought of. But others, many others, use the trauma to transform their lives, to find new ways of, new meaning in life, new purpose, and more hope. That's what we're talking about with the climate crisis, because this graph and the research done that caused this graph, this was initially developed by the Canadian Red Cross, and then we've worked with them and others to sort of enhance it. This was based on a one-time disaster. This is what they see around the world in one-time disasters. So when you start thinking about multiple, ongoing, repetitive, cumulative, and intergenerational traumas, this looks altogether different. There isn't the time, sufficient time to recover. There's more and more disasters that hit people. We have to help people learn how to not only move through the recovery, the dissolution and recovery stage, but also how do we find new meaning, hope, and purpose in the world, in our lives through this experience, because most are not bouncing back to where they were before. Next slide, please. So that's what we mean by transformational resilience, and it's essential, we think, for climate change. Here's my definition of it, and this is a version of post-traumatic growth, if you've heard that term. It's the ability to constructively cope with climate and other diversities and use them as catalysts to learn, grow, and increase not only your own well-being, personal, but the well-being of others and ecological well-being substantially above pre-crisis levels. Next slide, please. So there's some key elements that we have found in our experience and the team members that we've been working with for a number of years on these issues. And you've heard from Elaine Miller-Karras. She's one of our core team members. But what we're talking about is sort of three different types of skills that we begin to teach everyone. And they're all age and culturally and demographically appropriate information and skills. Continue down one. The first is trauma-informed skills, as we call it, which is information about how trauma and stress can affect an individual's mind, body, and behavior, and the ability to sort of notice the symptoms in the body, but also information, basic information, simple information to help people understand how traumas and toxic stress affect the behavior of groups. So when they see groupthink happening and panic in a group, they have a basic understanding of what's going on. Oh, I get it. Oh, that's what's happening now. Okay, what can we do about it? And again, awareness of the symptoms of that reaction, the mind-body reaction to trauma and stress. The second, then we also want to teach people, and by the way, in my work, I'm out in the field often, I find that just helping people learn how trauma and toxic stress affect them, their own body, mind and body, and groups, makes a huge difference in how they respond, even if they don't learn any of those other skills I'm going to talk about. And I know many of you feel that way because you do this kind of work. The second is what we call presencing skills, which are basically self-regulation skills. There's psycho-emotional self-regulation skills. That's the kind Elaine Miller-Karras teaches, the somatic skills. But there's also personal, the development of robust personal, social, and ecological supports. I'm going to do an exercise in a second to help you understand that. And also there's cognitive awareness and control skills, helping people realize when they're catastrophizing or when they're blaming others. Continue down, please. So presencing is critical, and that's what most of the resilience programs focus on or limit themselves to, helping people develop more self-regulatory capacity. But with climate change, because it's going to go on for decades and the impacts are going to grow worse over time, we also need to help people learn how to use those adversities as catalysts to learn and grow and find new sources of meaning and growth. So that's adversity-based growth. We call it purposing skills, call it whatever you want. So one is how to learn and find meaning in the adversities. Another is to clarify the values you want to live by in the midst of adversities. And then the third set of skills is really finding ways to engage in activities that provide hope. And there's a wide variety of skills, tools that you can use for all of these different kinds of steps. Next slide, please. So let me give you an example of a presencing skill this one I developed a number of years back, and we find it pretty effective, that you can use. Please use anything, in fact, that you've seen. But it's aimed at helping people identify their strengths, their skills, their resources, and their social support networks. So if you're willing to play along with me, we're going to do this rather quickly, but I want to give you some time to try this out. If you just draw a circle in the middle of a piece of paper and put your name in the middle of it, but leave space around it, and then move one, just advance, there we go, and in there put the personal skills you think you have to deal with adversity, to calm your mind and body when you're distressed. Advance one, please. And so up on the left side, you'll see some examples. It might be using your ability to use healthy methods to stay calm. Maybe you do yoga. Maybe you've learned one of Elaine Miller-Harris's community resilience model skills, body-based skills. Maybe you can just get good exercise, or you eat well, or you can be assertive, or you can reach out to others. What skills do you have that help you stay calm in the midst of adversities? And just write those skills down. We're not going to give you enough time to write them all and think it through, but just see if you can get even one or two. Then you can go back after the webinar and finish this exercise. Okay, advance one. Now write down your internal supports that help you deal with trauma and toxic stress, with adversities. Advance one, please. And over on the left, you see what we mean by images you can bring to mind of experiences you've had, or places you've been, or role models that when you think about those images, those people, they bring peace and comfort to your mind. For example, I often go out to the Metolius River out here in Oregon, and just thinking about being on the Metolius, sitting on the side, watching the river flow by, it just calms myself. I just find myself being calmed. And another example is I used to have a 17-pound kitty cat named Beluga, and just the image of holding Beluga in my arms just brings calm to me. So do you have some internal images, internal supports that help you calm yourself? And just write down one or two of those. And then just advance one, please. Can we advance the slide one space? Not seeing it move forward. Allison, if that's possible to move. There we go. So now make another circle around yourself and put in this circle your external supports. And you see over on the left side, These are family or friends who can provide you unconditional emotional support or practical assistance when you need it in times of distress. It might be your spouse, it might be your parents, other siblings, it might be friends that you know. Who can you count on to give you unconditional emotional support or practical assistance when you need it in the midst of adversity? And just list their names there. And again, we won't give enough time to really think it through, but maybe you can write one or two people there. And then the external supports also, I'm sorry, I got that little messed up there. Also, do you have external physical places that you can go to that provide a sense of calming for you? Physical places. So I have a room in my house where I go to do meditation. Do you have some place like that? Or maybe a garden you can walk out to, that just walking around the garden, it can calm you. Or a place in town. I have, for many, many years, I played basketball with a group of old guys early in the morning. And so just going down to the YMCA and being with my friends calms me. Maybe you have an emergency kit in the house that helps you. Knowing that it's there for a disaster will help you. What else what do you have that are external physical kinds of things as opposed to the internal psychological or mental images or people? What other do you have that can bring that sense of calm and peace to you? And then finally, write down one more circle, write down your ecological supports. And what we mean by that is, does your resident have a yard? Where you live, do you have a yard or trees or garden? Or inside your house or residence or apartment, do you have a house plants or pets you can count on? Does your community have green space or trees or walkways, wildlife, streams, etc.? All of those connecting with nature, with ecological processes and can really help calm yourself. How aware you are of these ecological supports? How often do you find ways to connect with them? But just write them down so you become aware of them. So again, we won't have time to go through this, but I wanted to allow you to sort of get a sense of an exercise we've developed. We found this very effective, especially if you do it a couple of times. First of all, you want to give people time to really think it through, then talk about it and examine this and say, what are the strengths you see here? What might be missing? And is there some area you want to focus on trying to make robust? Maybe it's a better stressor support network. Maybe it's some physical external supports. Maybe it's really connecting with nature more and really try to strengthen your circles of support. Very effective tool. Next slide, please. And then I'm going to give one quick example of a purposing skill, and that's the second. So the circles of support was a presencing skill, helping you regulate your nervous system to calm your mind and body. But now, how do we find meaning, direction, and hope in the middle of an adversity? So just slowly move through this. We all have a certain level of functioning. Then some sort of adverse event comes along. Keep going there. And it can knock us off, and we become dysregulated. It happens to all of us. It's life. Over time, many of us will recover to some semblance of where we were before. We call this often resilience or bouncing back. But some people, and many of us can, with skills and growth, use that adversity to grow, to learn and grow, and we call it transformational resilience. Which means moving well beyond our previous level of functioning while holding the pain of the trauma in a different way. Keep moving down. And it requires that we make a choice. And a choice is sometimes conscious, sometimes not. We can say to ourselves, I can continue to suffer, or I can use the experience to honestly examine and learn about the world and myself and find new sources of meaning, purpose, and hope in life. This is post-traumatic growth. This is the way we can actually help people use climate adversities to actually increase not only their own well-being, but the well-being of others, and begin to restore the natural environment. Next slide, please. So let's do one little exercise. Again, we won't have much time to dig into this, but I wanted to give you a taste of it. One of the keys of purposing is to use an adversity, a climate disaster, toxic stresses, to tell a new story about the world and yourself. Our old stories are always our mental models, our assumptions and beliefs about the world are created by our past experiences. And with climate impacts and the cumulative and surprising impacts of the climate, ecological, biological crisis we're now in, we need to really begin to find ways to alter our mental models, to think and act in different ways, because the conditions that existed, from which we developed our previous mental models, in many cases no longer exist or are fundamentally changing. So one way to do that is to ask people to answer the miracle question. You just ask people to say, imagine that you go to sleep tonight and something magical happens. You are suddenly aware, suddenly able to think and respond to a distressing event or events in the ideal way you would like, the way that helps you avoid harming yourselves or harming others or the natural environment, and the way that allows you to live with dignity and pride. And then suddenly when you wake up in the morning, you find that you now have that capacity to respond in the ideal. You're no longer denying that it's happening. You're no longer dissociating from it, disconnecting. You're no longer acting out and going and being angry, looking for revenge. Somebody caused a problem. You're now really able to respond in the ideal. Go down a little bit more, please. So if you can just bring to mind a difficult situation or adversity you recently experienced, maybe it was a problem at work, a problem at home, something that's happened in your life. Continue down. So bring that, and you can work with others doing this, bring that situation to mind. How did you respond to that difficult situation? How did you feel? What was going on internally within you? Where was the tension held in your body? And then ask yourself, how would you respond? What would you do differently now if you responded to that difficult situation in the ideal? What would really be different? What would you ideally would have liked to do in a different way? Next slide, please. Next down. It's on the bottom here. And then think about, how could you bring that ideal to fruition? Next slide, please. And another way you can do this is you ask people to clarify the values they hold dear to their life, that they would like to live out in the middle of adversities, that would increase their sense of self-esteem and move them to the ideal self, and help them tell a new story about the world and themselves. So we have people go through and identify the top 3 values they'd like to live, they'd like to live out, that allows them to live with dignity and purpose in the middle of adversity. You circle that, next, keep going down a little bit. And then you ask them to go back and look at that distressing event and say, what would you have done differently? How could you have lived your life or responded in a different way if you lived out your core values during that experience? So these are 2 different skills you can use to help with purposing. Next slide, please. Well, there's 3 pillars of transformational resilience that are critical to helping people in organizations and groups and communities learn these skills. This is what we found through our experience and research over the last 6-7 years. The first is trying to create trauma-informed and resilience-skilled members. Excuse me. What this means is, just what we were talking about before, giving everyone information about how trauma and toxic stress can affect their mind and body, affect the behavior of groups, and giving them these skills I just talked about to help them self-regulate and find meaning and purpose in life in the middle of adversity. But this means everyone in your group or everyone in your community, all adults, all youth, learning these skills. That's critical. But just as important is a healthy social environment. And what this means is organizations, nonprofits, public, private, in the community beginning to communicate about these issues and develop really strong communication methods so that everyone can help others learn these skills and reinforce these skills. And the third is what we call an enabling culture. This is the leaders of the community, public, private, nonprofit, faith leaders, education leaders, social service leaders, coming together to talk about and what kind of cultural narratives, social narratives dominate our community now, and how do we begin to promote social narratives that promote health, safety, just and equitable and resilient responses to adversities. So you get a culture that enables that. You get all the organizations, or many of them in your neighborhood or your community, beginning to communicate together about how to work that, and you also focus on giving individuals those kinds of skills. Next slide, please. And I can talk about some examples of this. So again, imagine that there's the benefits of a global or U.S.-based preventative transformational resilience movement that helps, keep going down please, helps everyone, all adults and all children, not just the social service providers, not just the educators, but everyone become trauma informed, help understand and build on their strengths and enhance their protective factors so they can think and act in healthy ways, even in unhealthy conditions. Continue down, please. And imagine launching a movement in your community or in your state that helps all leaders, nonprofit, public, educational, private sector leaders, promote social narratives, come together to promote social narratives that really begin to shift the cultural norms and practices and make their groups, make their communities safe, healthy, just, and equitable, resilience-enhancing entities. Next slide. And imagine the benefits of a real powerful movement that helps everyone learn how to use climate and other kinds of adversities as powerful transformational catalysts to find new meaning, direction, and hope in ways that motivate people to increase not only their own well-being, but social and ecological well-being as a way to increase their own sense of well-being. Next slide, please. So I just want to encourage everyone to join together and join us and join ACES Connection Network to launch a movement to make the U.S. and all other nations trauma-informed, human resilience-enhancing societies for the traumas and toxic stresses generated by climate change. Next slide, please. And I'll stop here. You can read this. This is a little information about the ITRC and what we're doing. We really welcome your participation, encourage you to become a member. Get on our website, you can become a member. And down at the end, here's some history of what we've done. But down at the end, you see that we've just issued a call to action on the climate, mental health, and psychosocial spiritual emergency. You can find this on our website. And we ask you all to, if you're interested and find this compelling, to sign that call to action, to endorse it, and or get your organizations to endorse it so we can build a strong movement to get out front of these issues by creating a culture of transformational resilience in our organizations, in our communities, and in societies and nations around the world. I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Gail.
Thank you for that, Bob. Wonderful. Really, really great. Okay, we have several questions, and I do, if we have a chance, I want to, maybe I'll do that right now. One of the things that Bob was saying is let's start this movement, and I want to, I think we have some folks from the climate resilience world and the ACES resilience world, or ACES connection, ACES initiatives and resilience world. And what Bob and I were talking about before the webinar started is we really want to be sure that if you're working in a community, then you reach across and you try to find, if you're in climate, you try to find that ACES initiative. And if you're in the ACEs initiative, you try to find that climate resilience initiative that's happening. And I'm going to just, I'll just say a couple words about something that I'm doing in the community that I live in. And we're doing exactly that. So I live in Davis, California, in Yolo County, and we have it's called Cool Davis, and it's a climate resilience organization that's been around for quite some time. And we also have an ACEs initiative called Resilient YOLO in Yolo County. And we are doing a lot of work on the human resilience side and have been making great progress. Both of the organizations have been making great progress. But one of the things that we are working hard to do now is to make sure that we're coming together as an organization and looking at the ways in which the folks from our human resilience, our ACEs initiative, can help provide information, provide support, provide resources, trainings, etc., to the Climate Resilience Cool Davis organization. And we're looking at doing trainings. We're looking at those first responders, training on the for the first responders that are the ones that are going to be first in line, needing to have their presencing skills intact, their regulation intact when they are called out for a fire or an extreme heat or a flood or some other disaster that's coming, that is going to be coming our way. So we're working on that, and it's in its infancy, but what we hope to do is continue to share some of those, some of the successes that we'll be working on about our trainings and the community as a whole. We're planning to do trainings for the community as a whole. And the little bit that I know is that the community members are eager for this because they do want to know that there's things that they can do and that they don't feel hopeless because there isn't much to do. We just hear the bad news and don't see anything to do about it. So we'll keep you updated on that on both the ITRC site and the ACEs Connection ITRC community site. Let's get to the questions. So first of all, and please, if there are any other questions, please add into the Q&A, add questions. But two questions that that came from an attendee from Butte County, and Butte County is where the Paradise Fire happened. So the campfire, called the campfire. So the campfire, the 1-year anniversary is approaching. So the question for you, Bob, is how would you approach needs in children and youth that were already facing adversity, who now also have unaddressed fears of climate change? Why don't I let you answer that first question, and then I'll read, there's a follow-up question from that same participant.
Well, thank you, Gail. And the 1-year anniversary is likely to be difficult for a number of people. That kind of event, they might have experienced the loss of their place to live. They might have experienced injury or possibly even the death of somebody. It can be very traumatic. So I would, first of all, make sure that this is a community response to the 1-year anniversary, that people get together and support each other. I would highlight how how people are doing, highlight anybody that actually really helped others during the event, and show examples and have people talk about how they're doing to deal with the adversities. I would not dwell too much on anger at PG&E or anyone like that, or even go too far into grieving. That can be very difficult, and some people will find that they can't get themselves out of it. I would focus mostly on helping people to lift their spirits as to how we are now beginning to come back from this. And for those who are still facing adversity, again, connecting them to others there that might be able to provide emotional support or practical assistance in some ways, funding, other kinds of resources would be very, very helpful. But also sharing or teaching some resilience skills to everyone. You might have a resilience training workshop. It could be a lunchtime thing, and it could be something done in schools, in nearby communities that many people have moved down there. And you start to give people skills as, hey, you know, we can use this now, and if there's something that happens in the future, we can use this then too. And in fact, I was talking to somebody who did experience the fire and escaped, narrowly escaped by the skin of their teeth with their children, her children from the fire. And she said that the resilience skills really helped her. They helped her learn how to, or remember how to calm her mind and body. Therefore, she's much more able to help her children now who are still struggling with adjusting to a new community she has to live in, etc. So you could use this as a time to begin to build resilience, but again, highlight the positive now, and even talk about what can we learn from this? What can we do differently? How can we learn? And really focus on a community-based positive response to that event.
Thank you, Bob. The follow-up, and one thing I just want to say to the Butte County question, I know there is a very active Butte County ACEs initiative and they are addressing these issues. And I think Elaine Miller-Karras has done some training there with her community resilience model. So I would encourage you to look on that map, the movement on ACEs connection, and find Butte County and get connected with them. So here's another question from that same person from Butte County. Also, how do you approach community resilience to climate change in a community where one of the things they care about the most is their natural environment, but they're triggered by the word climate change?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I am talking about climate change in this webinar and the work we do. But often when we're in the field, we don't use the term. I think you have to really, before you start working with a group or in a community, do some research, talk to people, and find out what terms resonate with them and what do not, and use terms that resonate them. So you can just talk about wildfires, for example, and building resilience for future wildfires and or smoke emergencies, or you could use the term disasters. You can use whatever term that seems to resonate, and just do some checking out with folks before you start talking about these issues. Many folks who are in the midst of a disaster or have experienced one, they don't care about climate change. As I said before, they're trying to survive. They're trying to get by, and so don't trigger images that divert that energy, if you will. Just find ways to communicate in their own, in a language and with images that make sense to them. I'll give you one quick other example, a funny story. We had a resilience bill, ITRC members from the Northwest put together a bill for the Oregon legislature in this last legislative session that would have examined how to make resilience education and skills training available to all Oregonians, all adults and youth in Oregon by 2025. We passed the bill out of the committee, but it didn't make it because the Oregon legislature ended up in chaos at the end of the year over a climate bill, and this bill sort of got mixed up with it. But the members of the Senate Preparedness Committee that we had to go through many of them were outright climate deniers. They were Republican climate deniers. And so we quickly realized that we want to move this bill if we're not worried about the word, so we just called it Building Resilience for Disasters. And they were fine with that because they're nervous about an earthquake here and a tsunami and wildfires. So we just called it, the bill is focused on building resilience for disasters, bam, passed unanimously out of committee. So I think you really have to just use language that resonates with folks and that doesn't turn folks off, and do some research before you start a program to identify what those are.
Thanks, Bob. Okay, and we have two more questions that I'm hoping we can get to. And Samuel has raised his hand. Samuel, I'm wondering if you can type in your question. We aren't using the raised hands component on this webinar. So let me read. So this is another question, Bob. I'm in the climate resilience community and just learning about trauma and its symptoms. The symptoms sound eerily familiar to the issues that plague the low-income African-American community I grew up in. Do you see the climate trauma transformational resilience movement as an opportunity to acknowledge and heal intergenerational, racial, and other systemic causes of trauma and their broad impact?
Thank you for that question. It's right on target. Yes, the answer is yes. And the reason is none of the skills developed for building resilience to climate change were developed for climate change. They were developed and we just put them together into a framework to help. We tried to figure out, to identify what was most helpful from a climate disaster and toxic stress perspective. But these skills help people deal with all types of systemic, historical, institutional traumas that many people of color have experienced and women have experienced and others have experienced. So we've seen when organizations and communities have started to focus on these kinds of skills, how it helps everyone with many types of adversities. And if you give people who have done the traumatizing to others these kinds of skills, if you help them learn it, they often go through this post-traumatic growth kind of experience. Many of them do, not all, but many, and they realize that what they were doing was harming others, and they come to an agreement in their own mind that they're going to begin to think and act in different ways also. So I think it can be a very, very powerful for everyone to learn these skills. I think climate change is going to be the overwhelming pressure that many, many people face. And again, they won't necessarily know it, that it's sort of in the background in many cases, but it is the pressure that's increasing traumas and toxic stresses. But it will also help with all sorts of other systemic, historical, institutional forms of racism, sexism, and other kinds of traumas that people, all of you and others experience. Yes, a very good question.
I am Samuel Habimara from Rwanda Resilience and Grounding Organization. He has two questions. Oh, unfortunately, the questions did not come through. So Samuel, if you can hear me, Bob and we would love to answer your questions. And if you can, we'll try one more time to unmute you, but if not, then what we will do is answer your question and get back to you. We'll email you and be sure that we get your questions answered. So Allison, try one more time to unmute and see if it works. You can definitely, we will be sharing the presentation slides. So the slides from the presentation and the webinar will be shared. I want to be sure that everybody knows that anyone who signed up will send you an email with the summary webinar and the slides. And Bob, type up that you want these slides to be shared and used as much as possible.
Absolutely. Any way that anybody wants to use them, please do. And I know Samuel in Rwanda, and if it's the same Samuel, I think, hello, and I'm happy to talk again. And it's been a year or so or two since we've talked.
That's wonderful. Okay, so I just want to, we're coming up at the end of our time. I want to try to keep this on time departure. And I just want to give great thanks to Bob and thank you, Bob, for this. This is such important, and I think there's so many things that we can do to not feel distressed and not get stuck in our hopelessness. And I'm encouraged by this, and I really want you, if you haven't joined ACES Connection, please join ACES Connection and reach out and find others in your community that are doing similar things. Visit ITRC, the ITRC site on ACES Connection, and the link to ITRC. And Allison, if you can put up the slide with our next webinar, which is Elaine Miller-Harris that Bob was talking about. So our next climate-related webinar in our climate series is the human impact of climate change, the Community Resilience Model Disaster Relief Program. We'll hear from Elaine and from one of her community folks that actually went through I think the Paradise Fire. So we'll have yes, right there in the aftermath of those the Paradise Fire. So we'll hear about Butte County and the Paradise Fire from somebody who actually went through it and learned from the human impact of climate change and the community resilience model. So thank everyone for your participation. I want to give a great shout out to our technical staff at ACES Connect. Thanks, Allison and Raphael. And stay tuned for the webinar recording, and please share them. And goodbye.